Right, I've been wanting to make this video for a while now and sort of talk about Australian fashion and this weird cultural cringe phenomenon that's going on. And it sort of transcends Australian fashion and Australian politics. But to kind of make sense of it, we need to go back. So the original cultural cringe as a phenomenon, as a concept, usually refers to Australia in the 1950s, particularly during a really long Liberal government that we had. And in Australia, Liberal is a party that is centre right, so a conservative party. And the Prime Minister at the time was Robert Menzies. And he really loved the Yanks. He loved his poms, and he would speak in a way that was really London accent, really British. And that started to manifest in the media apparatus. So the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Company, their news anchors would sound British, and our anthem at the time was "God Save the Queen," and this term of cultural cringe sort of came about, where Australians felt ashamed of this post-colonial sort of identity and subculture that we had created for ourselves. What am I even saying? Yeah, all of that happened. And there was this huge pushback where Australians were like, hold on a second, we're not being represented in our media. There is nothing coming out that is culturally representative of Australia. We're going back to our British roots, and we're cosplaying as something we're not, when really Australia, particularly in this era, there was huge class disparity under this Liberal government. Australian public felt so underrepresented that there was sort of a revolt against the media apparatus and the Liberal government of the time, and people consciously and subconsciously, overtly and covertly were like, hold on, no, this isn't right. We have a culture.
Australia?
Things started to change in the 50s and 60s, and Australia sort of started to find its own voice, or try to recapture an Australia that wasn't necessarily tokenizing ourselves, and it wasn't overly rooted in nostalgia, and it wasn't overly European or colonial. It was a blend of what Australia had become post-White Australia policy, which was a really diverse country full of a bunch of different ethnic and religious backgrounds, and that manifested in our art and in our fashion, and it was really cool. And so I hear you say, Jacob, what's the point of this video? Well, all of that long ramble about Australia's political and colonial history is to talk about, specifically in fashion, maybe the idea that cultural cringe still exists, and maybe it sort of never left. And so what I was thinking about the other day was lad and esche style and fashion in Australia, and the way in which we sort of have adopted that from the UK as well. But it's really different because culturally, lad, esche, bogan fashion, whatever you want to call it, there's slight differences in all three of those terms, but it's predominantly from the UK. It's derived from UK streetwear and the drill scene, but in Australia it doesn't necessarily have as explicit a connotation to, or as explicit a connection to rap. It's a lot more regionalised, and I don't know if me wearing my dad's Bunning tee, or I have a Dryzer Bone jacket and a really old Movie World tee because I think the design is really cool. But I don't know if I'm nostalgic, or if there's a sense of irony in me, or should I feel guilty of class tourism? It's strange. I'm not working class. I'm currently in college right now, and I want to do my master's degree next year. But both my parents are. We're definitely a working class family, and I'm not saying that to be I have street cred. I'm allowed to wear these things. You're not, because your parents earn X amount of money. But I'm just wondering, is it an unconscious thing, or am I doing it on purpose? And am I signaling for others, or do I just enjoy the nostalgia because it reminds me of an Australia, maybe one that doesn't exist anymore, and maybe one that I'm glad doesn't exist anymore? what I'm trying to get at is like, do Australians sort of fear dressing up? It's really interesting. Like, we all seem to have this tall poppy syndrome where even in jobs where you would imagine you're supposed to dress up, right? Like, you could work in corporate, in HR. I've even seen lawyers wearing sneakers. That's not a bad thing. Like, I'm not out here trying to be classist and say, oh, you know, if you work as X job, you should be dressing really nicely. But what does annoy me is when people want to dress nicely, is being kind. Like, when people want to wear a buttoned shirt and pants, you get chopped down. The tall poppy syndrome kicks in. It's like, whoa, actually, you're gay because you're wearing pants. You're gay because you're wearing leather shoes. Like, you're not wearing a Gymshark tee and Kmart pants. And I think for people who are into fashion, it's really hard to explain to someone who's not from Australia. I'm speaking from a man's perspective. I can't speak to women's perspectives, but it's really frowned upon. Like, I remembered, like, distinctly, me and one of my friends went out to a pub, or like kind of a club, kind of a pub, and I was quite aware of this tall poppy syndrome that Australians have, and it's something that I've embodied and that I try to get over. So I was wearing, like, I think essentially what I'm wearing now, but I had my dry as a bone. Actually, hold on, I'll get it. I will literally go get it.
We'll be right back.
And I had this on. This is not dressed up at all. Hello, editing Jacob here. I realized you kind of couldn't see my coat because of the camera angle, so I have included it in post. It should also be known that as of 2023, the Drizzabone company is now owned by Gina Reinhardt through her company S. Kidman & Co., along with the other Australian iconic brand, Rossi Boots. And in case you don't know who Gina Reinhardt is, she is an Australian oil magnate and mining magnate who has made all of her money through the company Hancock Prospecting, which is owned by her father, Lang Hancock. And she is a fat piece of shit, and I will insert an image for you here. That's all. And I think this is the upper echelon. This is the limit of, like, you are a male going outside to a club, bar, pub, whatever, in Australia. This is like the ceiling of nicety. And I was wearing, like, I think Doc Martens. And that was fine. No one said anything. I probably got a few looks, but it was fine. Now, one of my good friends... Hold on, this is annoying me because I'm inside and it's like 80 degrees. I'm going to take it off. One of my friends was wearing this, like, really cool trench coat. I thought it was awesome. It was like a moleskin trench coat, and I was like, that's really cool. And some drunken fool comes up to us and starts, like, just pulling at his trench coat. And I was like, are you okay? And he's like, oh, you know that's gay. Why are you wearing a trench coat?
Gay! Gay! Gay!
And this dude was super inebriated, so I wasn't gonna kick up a stink about it. But I was just like, I said to Nate, I was like, let's go. So, like, why is hyper casual clothing just the societal norm? It is infuriating. And yeah, does our sort of casual style, does it reflect an Australian sense of humility? Or is it insecurity? Or is it, like, just tall poppy syndrome kicking in? Or is it kind of both? Are we a humble but also scared to dress up sort of society? I wanted to draw some comparisons to sort of other countries that have a bit of a similar vibe going on with Australia's sort of dress sense culture. But even then, I think these countries are unfortunately doing better than us. But they're the closest comparisons that I have. So the first one is just like the entire Eastern Bloc. like that part of Eurasia, and like Gopnik style, so like classic like Slav Adidas tracksuits, Eastern Bloc style. Think like Gosha Rubchinsky. Like, I know that's a problematic topic, but that sort of styling, I think there's a lot of overlap between that sort of subculture and the way that it sort of portrays a refusal to seek employment, and that sort of neat culture, and the way that is seen in like some of Gosha's stuff, and like it's even some of Ye's stuff with Yeezy, like some of that kind of blends in as well, and like the Vivienne Westwood punk aesthetic, and then like in South Africa, like Zeph, which Die Antwoord unfortunately made popular, and sort of turned it into a parody of working class aesthetics, and I think that's really pertinent to Australian bogan lad esche subculture, because it's equally as parody, and there's equally layers of irony, not just in pop culture with things like Fat Pizza and Howzos and Upper Middle Bogan and all of that sort of caricatures of this aesthetic, but also because of the like Namcore aesthetic and the thievery of working class athleisure and subculture taken on board by these upper middle class sons and daughters of bureaucrats and senators and politicians, and how Die Antwoord, who, if I'm not mistaken, are like were quite wealthy before Die Antwoord, had a completely different aesthetic and vision. That sort of intersection of both of those cultures and the cosplaying of poverty, I think, is really interesting. So are all of these aesthetics working class at their origin, or have they all become this meta irony obsessed, globalized commodity? This is where it's hard to tell if it's cultural cringe, or is it like class tourism, or is it it can be both, I assume, and it can also be somewhere in between, and it's really interesting. I don't know, like I feel like Australia is very divided in its fashion sense. We don't necessarily have a national aesthetic. It seems to be really socioeconomically divided, and then even within that, we trend towards dressing more casually, even for positions that, say, in France or in the UK or in the US, you would typically wear something that's a lot more dressed up, a lot more formal. And maybe it's not a bad thing, and maybe we're not behind. Maybe it's just complicated, maybe it's just a lot of the cultural cringe never left us, and that tall poppy syndrome that Australians have that seems to just be embedded in every sort of aspect of our society, maybe that still exists, and maybe there's room for like Australiana as an aesthetic, and maybe there is room for the adoption of this UK aesthetic and the bloke core and the athleisure and the Nam core. But yeah, it's really interesting, and I definitely think TikTok and the fashion cycle speeding up and becoming sort of instantaneous, where there are several fashion cycles all at once, I think that's all sort of culminated into this perfect shitstorm where it's just really not black and white, and it's really tricky to know whether there is a national Australian fashion sense in the same way that there has been historically, and maybe it never existed in the first place. Maybe it's just a tokenized stereotype of what an Australian is. But yeah, this has been my first video, my first essay, my first ramble. Let me know what you think, and yeah, I'll see you hopefully again.